Good day, everybody. My talk this morning is about the coming together of growth economics and of urban economics, a marriage which I think has enhanced and enriched both of them. What I will do is I will start with a very brief recapitulation of the main strands of growth and urban economics, and then I will get on to the specifics of various individual cities drawn mainly from East Asia. Now, first point is, why do cities matter so much for growth economics? And this is a fairly recent phenomena, but the reason for this is that there is, as you all very well know, an extremely high rate of urbanization, which is a secular trend likely to continue well into the future. And it is in part driven by the fact that cities have an urban edge in productivity, and that the labor-saving bias in the agricultural sector means that fewer and fewer people are needed in agriculture, and many of these are going to move to the cities looking for employment, and looking for employment which is in manufacturing, in services, and other activities that have much higher productivity. The result is that an rapidly increasing share of the GDP in all countries, whether these are advanced countries or lower income countries, is now sourced from urban areas. This is as much as between 70 and 80% for the world as a whole. In addition, and this is very important for many countries, and especially for the smaller countries, which is that a very high percentage of the GDP now is concentrated and emanates from a few very large cities. And examples throughout the world, for instance, in the case of Seoul, the Seoul metropolitan area, which I'll talk about later, approximately 45–46% of GDP comes from that. A third of Thailand's GDP is from Bangkok, and so on in Cairo, Karachi, and Sao Paulo. Now, what are the kind of sources of growth, and what are essentially the dynamics of the growth process, and how does one sort of bring cities into them? As you all very well know, growth can be looked at from two directions. One is the sort of supply-based approach to growth, which looks at things like capital, labor, and total factor productivity. Now, for low and middle income countries, capital and total factor productivity are the principal and, I would say, complementary sources of growth, even though one must not ignore labor. But if one looks at a sort of life cycle of development, initially you must give much more prominence to capital and the raising of capital-labor ratios. And then I think as one progresses to sort of middle income status, TFP, total factor productivity, becomes increasingly important. The second aspect is the demand-based side of growth, which is a function of consumption, of investment, and of net exports. In both fast-growing economies, you see clearly, whether it's at the national level or it's at the local level, that the two reinforce each other, that the supply push must necessarily be reinforced by a demand pull, and the two work together. Now, let's deconstruct the supply side very quickly. As you know, in the case of capital accumulation, this requires what has been labeled as a enabling environment. Whether it's at the national level or the local level, this is an environment, usually an urban one, which creates the opportunities for entrepreneurs and others to invest. And it is also the milieu where financial and non-financial institutions mobilize resources and channel these into productive activities. Now, the productivity of labor, which is coming into the cities, depends increasingly on the kind of technology they have at their disposal, and a lot of this technology is embodied in capital equipment. So this is where the two things come together. The more you invest in up-to-date technologies, the more productive the labor is. And finally, there is the whole question of how you maximize total factor productivity, which is increasingly seen as the sort of the main driver of growth over the long term. And for this, a number of factors are needed. One, of course, is allocative efficiency, and this is allocative efficiency of the state, because the state generally plays a very large part in distributing resources. It's the allocative efficiency of market mechanisms, including, of course, and very importantly, financial markets. It is how much at the national and local levels there is investment in research and development and the building of research infrastructure. There is the innovation that comes out of this process of research. There is the volume and quality of skills which combine with capital to generate GDP. There is the management of companies and the quality of this management. And finally, and all these things taken together, how quickly a country or a city absorbs new technologies. When you move to the demand side, which is sort of complements the supply side, again, we are talking about a number of factors. To start with, at the national level, there's the question of the macroeconomic environment. How stable is it? Is it kind of buffered from cyclical fluctuations? Are inflationary pressures held to the very minimum? Is the risk of bubbles being minimized? Second factor here is that, and this is really very much an urban phenomena, is what are the sources of demand? And the most stable and growing sources of demand is an expanding middle class, which demands new products as well as standardized commodities. So again, the demand from this middle class, stable and growing demand is of critical importance. The third factor is that there is the local, or you might call even a national culture and institutions that encourages entrepreneurship. And it's the entrepreneurs that are actually doing the investment, and whether they invest or how much they invest is a function of the kind of institutions, particularly legal institutions and others that protect property rights, which encourage this investment. And last but not least, there are the national trade and foreign direct investment policies that both support openness, but in addition, openness is something that pulls in foreign direct investment, and in the process of pulling in foreign direct investment, it can stimulate exports and upgrade the level and quality of exports. Now, let's bring in cities into this equation. The success of both the supply and demand side drivers of growth depends very much on how urban centers respond to policies, to the market inducements, and to the opportunities, whether these are national opportunities or these are opportunities in the international market. And here, the cities are achieving a very dominant position because agriculture as a share of GDP is relatively small and shrinking rapidly. Even in low-income countries, say Pakistan, the share of agriculture is just around 20%. In the case of China, it's 9% and dropping. Now, the GDP share is small, but a very large percentage of the population still continues to reside in rural areas. So the importance of the agricultural sector has not gone away. It is just that its weight in GDP has declined. And so I come to the point that, which I noted earlier, is that GDP growth, if that's what one is looking at, really derives from the performance of the major cities that account for a huge amount of the GDP of a country. And the trends seem to be suggesting, which I will again talk about later in this talk, because the urban sources of growth, the importance of the urban sources of growth is on the increase. Now, when does a city become an engine of growth, an important driver of growth in a particular country? First, the engine necessarily, this is arithmetic, must account for a very large share of the GDP. And what we have discovered is that size confers certain advantages. In well-governed cities, with the right kind of combination of industries and balance of industries, size confers agglomeration economies and scale economies. And large cities, on balance, tend to be more innovative than others. And this may have simply something to do with just the sheer volume of resources that they command, whether these are human resources, research infrastructure, and sources of financing. Second factor is that the engine has a particular industrial composition. And generally, the industrial composition that seems to have an advantage is a composition with there's a diversity of industries which both confers stability and can be a source of exports and of a continuing sort of upgrading of these exports. A fourth factor here is that large cities are going to be probably having a much bigger middle class and a much faster growing middle class. And as I've said earlier, this is the group that takes the lead in consumption. And finally, engines are the ones that, because of their size, because of their industrial diversity, are the ones that tend to deliver stable and sustainable growth, which is what most countries are looking for. What are some of the other attributes of engines? And I've mentioned some of the most important ones, but let's look at some of the others. Engines very frequently, for a variety of geographical and historical reasons, are often capital cities. Almost all of the big engines of growth tend to be the places where the major universities have emerged. And because of the emergence of these universities and their industrial structure, these are the cities that accumulate large pools of skilled workers drawn from local sources, national sources, and from foreign sources. Large cities, which are engines, also tend to be where most of the financial institutions congregate, because this is where a lot of the resources are being generated and the demand for resources is greatest. Engines also tend to be the places which attract foreign direct investment, and through the influx of foreign direct investment, there can be much more by way of technological spillover as well as industrial diversification. Engines tend to be amongst the most connected cities, connected with other cities in the world, connected with other nations, and these tend to be, very importantly, exporting cities. And finally, large cities are the ones that have the broad tax base, so they are in a much better position to mobilize resources, and through the mobilization of resources, they are also advantaged when it comes to providing the kind of infrastructure that supports industrial growth and creates nice virtuous spirals. Now, having said that, let me note that it's not only the large cities that tend to be drivers. If you look at some of the medium-sized cities, in Amsterdam, Helsinki, Zurich, even if you look at the cities that comprise Silicon Valley, most of these are fairly medium-sized places. Cities with 3 million or less, sometimes no more than 1.5 million people. So it's not absolutely essential to be a large place in order to be a driver, an engine, and an innovative city. Mid-sized cities are also often very, very innovative. Now, let's just look quickly at the life cycle of what I've called these engine-type cities. Firstly, historically, engine cities have started out as industrial centers because, if you recall, the focus of a lot of innovation and technological change has been manufacturing industry. That's where a lot of it began, but now it has, of course, spread out to services. But that has been the initial focus. Most of these cities start out as industrial cities, and the European cities and the US cities, almost all of them began in this way. And then they absorb capital and labor from rural areas into productive cities. But it is the case that in the initial stages, They start out as manufacturing centers and then generally have tended to diversify into trade and into finance, as for instance in the case of a London, a New York, and a Zurich, which 70 or 80 years ago tended to have strong manufacturing sectors, and now most of those manufacturing sectors have migrated elsewhere. So then you come to the next stage of the life cycle, which is where many of the post-industrial cities now are. In these cities, manufacturing has shrunk to generally as little as 10% of GDP, and this has been displaced by a whole lot of producer services like engineering services, financial services, insurance, and so on, and creative industries, the multimedia, arts, video games, and so on. Manufacturing remains important, but a lot of the innovation and total factor productivity gains are coming from other sources. In these cities, it is less capital and labor that's driving growth, much more innovation that is important. That's where really the salience is, which is why this talk is titled as Innovative Cities. Innovation is becoming a core function, a core driver of growth in these particular cities as they mature and move out of the initial stage of development. In most cases, the engine cities, the post-industrial ones as well, tend to be increasing their share of the population. They continue to attract skills from elsewhere. They continue to attract foreign direct investment. Tokyo is an example of this, but it's not always the case that population tends to grow. In the case of Seoul metropolitan area, the population in fact is tending to shrink somewhat. And then I should also add that the post-industrial city, but even a city at an earlier stage, now requires massive investment in ICT and transport infrastructure, because a true engine of growth requires this type of infrastructure in order to support the manufacturing activities, in order to support trade, and also to remain connected with the rest of the world, because of course these cities are functioning within a globalizing environment. Let me now turn finally to talking a little bit about some of the notable and I would say new engines of growth. And I'm going to refer to the experience of 4 cities. These are East Asian cities: Ho Chi Minh City, Shenzhen, Singapore, and Seoul. And I will, drawing on the experience, highlight some of the key attributes which I referred to earlier. Now, most of these engines, all of these engines, in fact, have emerged after 1950. In the case of, for instance, of Singapore and Seoul, these were important places even before, but they emerged as engines of growth and of innovation starting sometime in the 1960s. In the case of Shenzhen, this was a small village in the 70s, and really sort of takes off once a special economic zone is created there in 1980, and then it just sort of zooms upwards. And in the case of Ho Chi Minh City, we see its transition to becoming an engine really starting to gather momentum sometime in the 1990s, and now it is continuing up. Now, all of these cities, 2 of them were capital cities and important administrative centers. Others have emerged as important industrial cities. So let me start with the first. Here is the case of Ho Chi Minh City. What I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that population has more than doubled between 1989-90 and 2010, and the trends continue to point towards rapidly rising population through 2025. It has a very large share of GDP. Almost a fifth of Vietnam's GDP is generated there. It has had very high GDP growth, almost 10% and more during the last 10 or so years. And as is typical for first stage engine, the share of manufacturing is very large. It's about 30% of GDP. It is also an exporting city. The share of exports is about 40% of GDP. It is a city that has attracted a lot of the foreign direct investment that has come into Vietnam, approximately 35%, and it's moving in the direction of building up the ICT infrastructure, which a sort of a card-carrying engine of growth and an innovative city really absolutely needs. And you can see the number of subscribers is growing up and the number of internet users is increasing. The case of Shenzhen, this is a case of an absolutely meteoric rise of a city from very small beginnings to becoming, I think, what is the third or fourth largest city in China and one of the powerhouses of the Chinese economy. Its GDP growth, I think, is unprecedented, double-digit rate over something like a 10-15 year period. I've only captured a small part of it. Its GDP itself has also zoomed up to a very high number. It is China's leading export city, and I believe it's been the leading export city for as long as the last 15 or 16 years. It is a magnet for foreign direct investment. In fact, China's the initial surge of investment, which began in the early 1980s, was to Shenzhen and some of the other special economic zones, and it has continued thereafter. The city has made a very smooth transition towards becoming an innovative city through heavy investment in research and development infrastructure, and it has become the locus of the activities of two of China's most innovative companies. Both Huawei and ZTE are located there, and their main research activities are located there. The city has built up a massive port, which is now the fourth largest container port in Asia and in the world, I believe, and its internet penetration rate has risen to 78%, which is amongst the highest for all of the cities in the region. Singapore, I'm sure you're all very familiar with it, very familiar also with the fact of its incredible performance extending over a period of 50 and more years. It is, as you can see, the population has risen from 650 to 5 million, and very importantly, a high percentage of the population of the city are foreigners, while many of them are unskilled workers. A major proportion of these are also skilled workers that contribute to the human capital stock of the city. Growth rate has been consistently very high. This is an export city par excellence with export ratio 1.58. As you can see, it started out as a manufacturing city, and manufacturing, in fact, till about 10 years ago was close to 30% of GDP. It is now typically coming down to 22% and probably will go down further. But nevertheless, manufacturing has a substantial presence in Singapore. The city, again, much like Shenzhen, is making a transition towards becoming a much more innovative place with heavy investment in R&D. It is the second or first, depending on which year you look at, container port in the region and the world. And again, internet usage, computerization, which contributes to the innovativeness city, reaches over 78 to 80% of the population. The final example I have here is Seoul. Again, this is now very much a city that is entering its post-industrial phase. 30 years ago, this was a manufacturing center, manufacturing all kinds of products, textiles, electronics, chemicals, and so forth. And now it is concentrating very much on creative industries, on electronics, on high-tech products. The metro area is very large, and as you can see, it has close to 1/2 of Korea's population. So the agglomeration and scale economies that the city reaps are very substantial. It has a very high share of the GDP of the nation. Growth rate for a post-industrial city is very respectable, 4 to 5% per annum. Industry remains, as I say, a factor here. It is now 14%, but 14% for a post-industrial city is nothing to be sneezed at. The export GDP ratio is substantial. The workforce is very highly skilled, and then this combined with Korea's very heavy investment in research and development means that Korea is now emerging, and largely on the strength of Seoul, as the country with, I think, the 4th highest level of USPTO registered patents in the world. As part of its effort to be connected to the rest of the world, Seoul has created the Incheon airport and the Songdo city nearby, and this makes it very highly linked up with the rest of Asia and the rest of the world. This is the 4th most busy airport by respect to cargo traffic, and I believe it has been for 5 years running named the best airport in the Asian region. Again, Korea has taken the lead when it comes to the use of internet and the mobilizing of computerization and digital technologies to develop video games and other creative industries, and you can see from the penetration rate why this is the case. So here is another one of the big engine cities. So we have moved from one which is at an early stage, which is Ho Chi Minh City, through one that is at a somewhat intermediate stage, Shenzhen, to Singapore, which is again now very much in the camp of post-industrial cities, and Seoul also now very much into the second stage and moving on. So what is the future of engines? It would appear from looking at the trends and recent developments that their first mover advantages, if reinforced by good governance, good management, and good sort of greening practices, and let me bring that term in here, it means that they are likely to retain the advantages they have had in the past and continue to be important for their countries. Whether they remain important and how much of a driver role they perform will depend very much on how they build up their innovation capacity and translate this into innovation capabilities that contribute to total factor productivity and to growth. A third factor, which is increasingly important, is the extent to which these cities take the lead in greening growth. And greening growth in particular means how they contain the energy intensity of production, especially through the use of and the development of effective urban transport, and through various kinds of zoning and land management policies, and how they introduce new green technologies and actually become a place where these green technologies are developed and refined further and produced. So what are the spillover effects that derive from the adoption of these green technologies? And finally, there's this whole question of how these engines continue to accumulate and serve as magnets for knowledge workers, which means that this will enhance their capacity to continue diversifying their economies, getting rid of sunset industries, moving towards new sunrise industries, and remaining, very importantly for their countries and for their own local economies, export cities. So I have a few suggestions for you with regard to reading, which will open sort of new windows for you into what is being talked about in the research literature and elsewhere. Some of these books are quite interesting, and they range very widely, and I would encourage you to perhaps dip into them. So thank you very much.